Kelsey, you're drawing a great crowd. So thank you once again for being here with us.
Awesome.
Awesome. So for those of you who don't know, and I don't think Kelsey really needs a formal introduction, but I'll just kind of go through it really briefly. Kelsey is he's a principal developer advocate at Google. He's an open source enthusiast. He's a widely recognized expert on Kubernetes, as you guys all know. He's been doing numerous podcasts and interviews for many different tech organizations in the industry. So we're lucky enough to have him here with us today. I'm really, looking forward to sitting down with you today. So I think it's going to be a great conversation. So it's interesting because my first introduction to you, Kelsey, was back in April of 2018. And that's actually when I started with HashiCorp. I started, pretty much the first week of April. And I remember that Mitchell Hashimoto was tweeting about bringing our Vault UI from enterprise into OSS into version 0.10. This is a huge thing. Back then, I was just like, I'm just still trying to actually, understand our old product lines. I knew Kelsey, and then he kind of like mentioned this and then it was interesting because I remember Kelsey responding to that tweet, something in regards to if we do the same thing for Vault Unseal, that he would wear a Vault t-shirt for a month, right? And I thought that was just so funny. And fast forward 6 months, at my first HashiConf, we announced open sourcing Vault Unseal, and Kelsey shows up, right? He shows up on stage with a hoodie, he unzips it, it actually has a HashiCorp, Vault t-shirt on. So that was awesome, Kelsey. That was super, super unforgettable.
So the backstory for people that don't know, I didn't know you were all going to release it. And I think I saw actually the announcement maybe the day prior. And I'm on the phone with the team like, yo, I'm going to just get a flight today. So I'm going to fly out to the conference so we can actually if it works, that was the prerequisite, it has to work. And I'll just do a little live demo. If it works, I'll actually unveil the HashiCorp Vault shirt and wear it for a month. I probably got it in for 28 days, maybe. My wife was looking at me weird at dinner with the HashiCorp shirt on. But yes, we made it happen. It was super spontaneous, and it's one of the dopest, keynote cameos ever.
Oh, absolutely. I 100% agree with it. I'll never forget it, right? But that was just phenomenal. So anyways, we're really glad to have you here. I know you actually have a long history with Mitchell, Armon, and have spoken numerous times at different HashiCorp events as well. So I'm really excited to sit down with you, like I said, and we'll take, once again, the next 35 minutes to go through some of these questions. Once again, what Ali had set up is we've actually kind of consolidated a list of questions from everybody, which is actually, joining currently up to 178, which is great. And I've taken the time to read through all of them. There's a lot of similar questions and themes. So I've actually picked a bunch of questions I consolidated into more comprehensive questions. And I think, these are some of the questions that would open up some great conversations with you. We'll leave some time at the end, once again, to open up to some open-ended questions through chat. So keep them coming. But if you're ready to start, Kelsey, let's get this rolling.
I think we should do a round of intros for all 181 attendees so far. It's only right.
Well, I think the Zoom chat I'm going to start pulling in like a bunch of different random commentary there. So we'll record this, but people can read through that at the end. So, but once again, thanks again. So Kelsey, I know I've talked to you a little bit, but tell us a little bit about yourself, your role at Google, how you wound up at Google, because you've had a very varied past, and also, what is your history with HashiCorp?
Yeah, my journey is self-taught engineer, no college, picked up the books, did the work, grinded through the industry, so many verticals from web hosting, tech support on the phone, trying to figure out how to get someone's MySQL back off the ground because of whatever they did to it. I've been a system administrator. I've been a VP of engineering, director of engineering, wrote a lot of code, broke a lot of code, or the pager for a lot of stuff, wrote some open source libraries. And through that trajectory, I landed at a place called CoreOS before Google. And that's where I just got really deep into this whole feedback loop of producing product, producing open source, getting really close to the community, getting really close to the customer. A lot of that work also started at Puppet Labs. And I came into Google kind of with this brand, if you will, like the Kelsey Hightower way is trying to make complex things simple, learning in public. And Google just has the technology that I aligned to, Kubernetes, Golang, Google Cloud. That was the service I was paying for before joining Google. And that is just kind of the best stage for me right now in my career where I can actually work on the things that I love in a very organic way and continue to engage with the community. And in terms of HashiCorp, I've known Mitchell for a very long time, right when they were getting that company off the ground. And I remember the very first HashiConf, I think it was in Portland at Armory, this small little venue. And I remember it kind of changed my way of thinking about when I'm at a third party keynote, like at HashiConf or others. I remember they announced, I think, Nomad, right? I was like, how do you announce like this new product with no demo? You got to have a demo. And I was scheduled the next day to talk about Kubernetes. And I was like, you know what? Last minute, we're going to change it up. We're going to do Kubernetes versus Nomad. So I went home, changed everything up, learned a little bit about Nomad. And I remember Mitchell and Armand are part of the Hashi team. They were just standing there, just taking the critical feedback, letting me do the comparison. It was very authentic. And that's how I knew that they really were more concerned about what they were building for the community than them just like competing with the other products, right? They were really trying to fill the niche that their community needed. And the fact that they let me do that, were very supportive and giving me those binaries to make sure I was going to be successful, that kind of set the tone for the relationship going forward.
That's great. I'm curious, like, I mean, you did that comparison. Is that still somewhere? I would love to see it.
Oh yeah, it's definitely online. It's one of those things where I think the UX that HashiCorp is known from, they talk about this in their product philosophy. They really try to make sure that things are easy to use, they have a purpose, and they connect with the rest of the stack, right? And this is where I think we started talking about HashiNetties and the Hashi stack comes from that philosophy, and they just execute so well. They build just enough, but then they also respect the fact that you may be using other tools. So even though we're talking about Nomad in this situation, I think we would go on over the years to see things like Vault, Console, make sure that they're also compatible with things with Kubernetes. And that's a big testament to the philosophy over there.
For sure, for sure. So obviously in your role at Google, you talk to a lot of enterprise customers. We, from the HashiCorp perspective, talk to a lot of enterprise customers. There's a lot of enterprise customers and prospects on the phone. And as you know, all of our customers and prospects have some sort of cloud strategy going to this year, right? Some of them have strategies for a long time already. But I'd be curious to see, what are some of the biggest challenges that you see your customers facing in moving legacy applications into the cloud? And also, what is the most important thing to establish when beginning anybody's cloud journey?
I think the biggest challenge is calling it legacy. Honestly, look, if you wrote software 30 years ago, this ain't legacy software. Like, I'm over 30 years old. I'm not legacy. I'm still going strong. I've only gotten better over time. And a lot of software that people have been building has been beneficial to their company. So if you can actually build something that can be around that long, like long enough for people to hate it, that's really a badge of honor. It's a sign of success. So I think the biggest thing is that most companies have stopped investing. They've abandoned their software. Like, you wrote this stuff, it's been deriving value. And since it's not causing any problems per se, it just doesn't get any attention. No software updates. Even when the team learns about new patterns that you see in the cloud native world, you don't go back and touch up those applications and preserve them and make sure that they can actually leverage some of the new things that are coming out now. So the biggest challenge is, if you're doing a digital transformation or whatever you've been sold, you're like, now I got to go and undo the mindset of that software is abandoned, re-examine it again, and then by that time, there's probably no one that wants to work on it, or there's no one that can work on it, and now you're asking them to all of a sudden care about a thing that has been forgotten for so long because you want to go to a new environment. So I think the biggest challenge is, this is not a digital transformation. This is a reminder that software is never done. You can never go on this transformation, AKA journey, and then abandon it again. You got to make a decision that we're not going to do that anymore. If we're going to have software that's going to be deprecated, then call it deprecated and be intentional about the fact that you're not going to upgrade and all those things. So that's the number one challenge. And then the second challenge is going to be talent. You see it all the time, right? Oh, I like Vault. I like Nomad. But here's the thing. Do I have the bandwidth to really learn how that stuff's supposed to work, integrate it with the rest of my stack, and then make some key decisions about what should leverage that platform and what should not? And that's where the biggest challenge is. Even when the team is on board, they have the right mindset, they may lack the talent or the time to execute.
No, I think that's some great guidance there. You'll see. So for everybody on the phone, for those HashiCorp fans, I think everybody probably has heard about our cloud operating model. That's kind of like our viewpoint as far as journey into the cloud. The basis of our thesis really lies in the implication that the transition towards cloud is a shift from static infrastructure to dynamic infrastructure. It's a shift from configuring and managing a static fleet of IT resources to, as you guys know, provisioning, securing, connecting, and running dynamic resources on demand. The HashiCorp approach is to focus on workflows, like everybody knows as well, rather than just the underlying technologies, like you mentioned, Kelsey. There's the assumption that we will live in a multi-cloud world moving forward. So working at Google, you've obviously got some bias towards GCP, but what is your take on the reality of multi-cloud going forward?
The reality of multi-cloud, the only reason why people even say multi-cloud, think about it. It's usually because they've never operated in two disconnected environments before, right? Even on-prem, most people have never dealt with multiple data centers that are so far apart that you have to think about network latencies. You have to start thinking about security protocols beyond L2 firewalls, where you're just blocking ports and IPs. Once you ever get into a world where you start dealing with multiple, you know, far apart data centers, a lot of the multi-cloud stuff you hear come up around how do I federate authentication? How do I deal with network latencies? How do I deal with overhead of storage and replication? All of these things are just true of multiple environments. So the reality is, even though people say multi-cloud, is that cloud is a forcing function for you to move beyond the four walls you have that you call your data center or co-location. If you think about inside of a single data center, no one says multi-vendor, right? You got your switch from Juniper, you may have your router from Cisco, you got your racks from HP. You don't say, oh, I'm doing multi-vendor, because it doesn't make any sense, right? Because everything is close enough that Cat5 cables fit. There's enough standards to glue everything together, and you have a working system. The cloud's a bit different because every cloud provider has their own form of identity. And this is where tools like Vault become interesting. Like when I really understood the power of Vault, right, in the context of multi-cloud, if you think about just Unix, right, MySQL versus Postgres versus SSH, they all three have different ways of logging in, username and password. So what Vault does is says, look, I'm going to give you an abstraction over all these identity services. So instead of you learning IAM for Amazon, IAM for Google, and then dealing with username and passwords, how about this? Let's uplift that conversation and say, I'm going to give you one set of credentials for Vault. And then behind the scenes, I'll do all the things necessary to deal with Amazon's IAM credentials, create them on the fly, and then give them to your app just enough to do its work and then destroy them. So this is really the biggest challenge in terms of multi-cloud, is that they're incompatible with each other. And tools like Vault provide that kind of facade, that bit of glue. So that way you can actually just kind of stick to the high level principles of authentication and authorization, and then just kind of bury some of the differences between the cloud providers. So that's the reality. They're all different, and we're going to have to rely on tooling to kind of close those gaps until we get more open standards across the board.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think from the multi-cloud perspective, I think a lot of enterprise customers have like this on their roadmap moving forward. But from the reality perspective, and from your talks with your customers at Google, right? I mean, do you see this as reality soon for a lot of customers? Or do you think this is more long-term? Like, what do you see out there?
Define cloud, right? So you got an internet service provider. They're providing you your network traffic going back and forth. That ISP is considered a cloud provider, actually the very core of your cloud provider. And then your email service, whether you're using Microsoft Office 360 or G Suite from Google, that's also a cloud provider storing your email. It's more service oriented. So people will start to put SaaS into that. If you're using GitHub or Salesforce, a lot of Fortune 1000s are using Salesforce for all their critical financial data. So companies have already engaged in this concept. What we're really talking about is at the infrastructure for the custom software that you're building, does it make sense to leverage multiple providers for what we would consider a commodity? So when you start to talk about the commodity layer, like, oh, I want 10 VMs from here and 10 VMs from there, like that doesn't make a lot of sense if you just want commodity to commodity. You might as well just have a fallback strategy. When you start to really start to get leverage, you might say something like this, like, oh, I love Google's machine learning APIs. So we're going to run the workloads that use those APIs over there. For my mobile apps, I'm going to run those apps on the mobile device, whether that's iOS or Android. So really what we're talking about is, what is the cloud provider providing you that you can't get otherwise in the form of a commodity offering. That's where multi-cloud becomes a real reality.
Yep. No, it makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. So, obviously you're known for being an open source enthusiast, and I know we've talked about this as well, but what are your thoughts on enterprise software companies such as HashiCorp and what the value that closed source or enterprise features provides to its customers?
Yeah, I was managing, I started this project called ConfD, and it's an open source project that allows people to configure things. And the goal was coming from a place like Puppet, I would build a tool that just did enough configuration management for the new world of containers. So I just needed a way to describe my config, use a key value store like console or etcd, and then generate a config because that's all you need in this new world. And I remember that project got popular. And there was a large company sent me emails like, Kelsey, we love the work that you're doing. You're so amazing. We need a little support though. We need you to implement this new set of features. I'm like, no, that's not my priority. I got something else to do. And that's not part of the package. Well, who can we call to get support? I don't know. 1-800, not my problem. Like seriously, I'm literally trying to provide some software, but it doesn't come with support. If you want new features, I ain't doing that. I don't have time to do that. And it's nothing wrong with that. So when we start thinking about a commercial company that's relying on dependencies, I'm glad people use the software I put together. But here's the thing. If you want a business relationship, then you need to engage with a business. And if you're a business that makes money, expect the businesses you depend on to make money. And if they don't make money, then they won't be around. Like, I don't know why this is such a challenging concept for a lot of folks, because when we hear free software, even though we all know the memes around that, you have to make sure that the company I want to support me, that I'm willing to support them. So the way I think about this is we have a big community. I love the open source community. And when I look at that open source community, let's call it 1 million people, 10 million people, there's a subset of that community that really loves me back. So much so, they're willing to pay me money for the work that I do. And we tend to call them customers, okay? And customers that vote with their dollars, I want to make sure that I stick around to be able to provide some priority for them. So if they want a certain set of features to be successful in running their business, and they're willing to put a little bit of money on the table so I can afford to pay my engineers to have that focus, I think that is just necessary. It's not a bad thing in enterprise. And I think when I look at, like we talked about that story earlier about Vault, some features start as enterprise and then they show up in the open source arena. And I think that's the right pacing, because there are some features that don't make sense to be open source. Like if a feature requires a $200,000 security device to use, like HSM support in Vault, that doesn't make a lot of sense to be maintained in the open source community. It's okay to say, look, if you got one of those, then you can afford an enterprise license to make sure we can do the Q&A to make sure this thing works properly with the proprietary piece of hardware.
No, I think that's great. Seems like you should actually go into enterprise software. Oh wait, you are. So no, that's I think that's some great feedback and things which I hear all the time as well. But I don't think everybody really kind of pays attention to kind of like the background and kind of like the effort that goes into developing enterprise features for complex integrations out there, like you mentioned as well. So I think that's a great point as well. So here comes another kind of question which is correlated with this, and I think a lot of people on the phone are probably going to be interested in this, but what do you think is the biggest hurdle for HashiCorp's enterprise products as the expert in technology? What do you see us kind of going through? What kind of struggles do you see us potentially kind of encountering because of the enterprise feature set that we do actually have on top of Terraform, Vault, Nomad, and Console?
Do you want the truth?
Yes, absolutely.
So I think all your customers are also keeping a lens on this. So when we look at the cloud provider's job is to continuously listen to their customers and establish a feedback loop in terms of features. If I look at Vault and I love its API, then what you're doing, you just effectively raise the bar for what it means to have a security product of that nature. So now my customer base is going to come to me and say, hey, Kels, I need something like Vault. Now, there's two ways to get in there. One is great partnerships, meaning I can go to the HashiCorp team and you have a price of, efficient product that fills that need. So I can stick with the HashiCorp brand, I can stick with the API, and I can get service from you. And I see that trajectory going. But here's the thing. If you don't meet the bar in terms of that level of integration, meaning I need billing integration, I need workflow integration. If I choose to use Google's G Cloud command, I really want that to work even when I'm dealing with you, because I don't think anyone wants to go off. It's like, streaming video. Like everyone complained about cable. It's like, oh, I'm paying $40 a month for cable. And now I'm paying $7 trillion for 10,000 apps to watch 5 shows. So no one really wants to have a different service and different vendor and different invoice for everything that they want to do. So you have to kind of pay attention to the full life cycle of adoption of software going forward. And then the next thing you have to do is just make sure that you're always competitive in the marketplace. So, if I were to look at console, the bigger risk there would be infrastructure products tend to get pushed down lower in the stack as new solutions rise above. And the way you have to counter that is saying, hey, console needs to play nice with Kubernetes, because you have to make sure it's clear. And one thing, for example, console is replaced by etcd inside of Kubernetes. But one thing I think the console team did good was pay attention. Hey, service mesh is a thing. We already have all this network telemetry data in console. How about we surface that data and then provide a control plane that's easy to use, following that HashiCorp philosophy? Because it's going to always be opportunity in workflows and UX. No matter what's on the market, you always have an opportunity there. So when I saw Console Connect come out and say, look, we get it. The landscape has changed. People want service mesh now. We're going to give you a control plane. And then what we're going to also do is give you libraries, and we're going to integrate to things like Envoy versus creating a new one from scratch. I think that's the key to staying competitive, and you got to win that business every month and every year.
Yeah, I mean, it's the mind share behind things. And it's funny that you mentioned this thing about cutting cable, because I personally cut my cable, cut the cord about 3 months ago, consolidated everything, and I've been loving it. So no, that's great, actually. Here's another great question from one of the people that actually are probably online currently. But so we've talked a lot about our HashiCorp tooling, about Vault, a little bit about Nomad, a little bit about Console. But if you actually had to say, what is your favorite HashiCorp tool? What is it and why?
Ooh, I'm gonna take two. Number one would be Vault is my number one favorite product. And what I mean by product is that it's a thing people are willing to pay for. And it solves a problem that straight up there aren't really many great end-to-end solutions for, right? There's lots of secret management tools, but a lot of them don't really think about the full workflow, which is I need to make sure that the credentials I curate have a life cycle to them. They need to be cleaned up. So whenever I see a tool that thinks about all of the best practices being baked in by default, that tends to win that particular race for me mentally. And then from a product perspective, I've met lots of customers who pay for Vault and they smile. Like, hey, we bought that Vault and we're using it in production. That's some people buy stuff that they don't use. Like people have bought like virus scanners and no one knows if it runs anymore. People have bought little agents that run on their server, don't even know what value they're getting out of it. Whereas Vault is really hands down one of the best products that people can pay for. The second favorite is Terraform. And Terraform is a great project, right? I'm surprised that you get people to pay for Terraform, but I understand why, because we talked about that support part. If my business is going to rely on Terraform to configure all of this stuff, then number one, I need great support. I need to be able to support things even if a cloud provider doesn't. So I understand what they're paying for, but it's one of the few projects that we've seen in a long time where everyone agrees that, you know what, HCL is a great foundation. Even native cloud providers are generating the backends and owning that themselves. That's hard for any company to do, even for a startup to say, hey, Microsoft, hey, Amazon, hey, Google, can you keep your backends up to date while we go focus on filling the gaps and doing things like policy and providing hosted solutions? So those are my two. Terraform, because it's ubiquitous, it's a great consensus builder across teams and allows people to serialize their culture. When you make decisions about the tools you're using, you can go and serialize those things into Terraform. And then Vault, because man, hands down, not a lot of competition in that space.
No, I mean, that's great insight. And, obviously Terraform and Vault are our two most popular products as far as our enterprise offerings. Hopefully next year when I sit down with you, your answer is going to change to Console Nomad. So we'll see how that goes. All right. So I know we've focused a lot about just HashiCorp stuff, but, as far as yourself, Kelsey, you're one of the most recognized voices in the Kubernetes space. You're one of the original contributors. What has that journey been like for you? Because most people on the phone and most customers that we talk to has some kind of Kubernetes strategy as well as a cloud strategy, right? How did you get started? How do you think Kubernetes has matured in the last 6 years? And I can't believe it's only been 6 years, but it seems like it's been longer for much longer. And what changes do you see moving forward?
You got to understand the angle that I came into the Kubernetes with. As a Linux system administrator, I remember like logging into a server for the very first time. And you get on there, you're not quite sure what to do, and you start to learn about init systems and a packaging format. And I remember building my first RPM and creating my first spec file, and then making a reproducible build with a tool called mock, where you would just get a nice clean chroot, recompile the app, and then I will create an init script. And I remember I got to the point where I could do yum install, the app will come up, service start, the app will start running, and then service stop, boom, and then I learned how to do upgrades. And once I had that kind of power, I was able to think about leveraging Linux and operating systems very effectively, even for custom applications. And then when we started to go from like just a handful of servers to hundreds of servers because of virtualization, I remember like you had to think about auto scaling, horizontal scaling, integrating to load balancers, and all of us wrote 2 trillion bash scripts, right? Like this bash script does this, and you got to run this in this order. And then configuration management comes along and says, look, we're going to effectively give you a DSL for writing these scripts in a more systematic way. But we never really got new abstractions. We wrote a lot of code, but we never changed the underlying platform that we were working against. And then I remember seeing Kubernetes for the first time. I was working at CoreOS. We were building a competitor. We were building this so-called fleet, right? The model at CoreOS was Google's infrastructure for everyone else. So we built things like etcd. We built this kind of operating system based on Linux that was just shrinking things down, optimized for containers. And we were making this attempt at saying, can we build a cluster operating system to allow us to not think about machines and think about apps? We had the pieces. We had containers. We had the kernel. We had all this other stuff, but we didn't have the abstractions. So when Kubernetes came along, I remember the project was being launched, and I was trying to hurry up with the blog posts so that CoreOS would have some news to share in this space. And I learned how to get it all installed. And I remember just running my first container via Kubernetes. And I was like, this is a game changer. All the stuff that I learned over 20 years is built in by default. How to give IPs and rotate them, how to think about services, how to think about when one application dies or a machine dies and the application runs on the other side, because now we have this concept of state and something fundamentally different than config management. The state is active. It's actively being reconciled. We're not talking puppet run, puppet run, puppet run, and hoping and crossing our fingers that it eventually gets us to where we want to be. In the Kubernetes space, things are so tight, the contracts are so intentional, that I was watching all the things that I thought the best system administrator should know how to do be ready out of the box. And when you talk about evolution over time, Kubernetes starts with that. It starts with 20 years of best practices baked in. And then what you see afterwards was just addressing more workloads that we could run that way. You want cron jobs? We can do that. You want machine learning jobs via Kubeflow? We can do that. You want a CI/CD system? We can do that. And then what emerges from that is this concept of CRDs and this idea that we would actually have a first-class way of extending the platform. That way, anyone else can build these first-class things, almost like a Terraform module, right? In Terraform, you learn how to build HCL. You can make modules that feel just as first-class as the cloud provider ones. But Kubernetes did this for the infrastructure platform layer, and that was a game changer. We have RBAC. We now have rich security policies thanks to Open Policy Agent. So now we've moved to an era of infrastructure as data, right? We always talk about infrastructure as code. That's automation, that's scripting. It's fabulous. But once you change the abstractions where we don't have to think about if, then, do this, we move into a world where now the abstractions are described as just data. We give the data to the control loops, and they still handle the if, in, then, else, but we don't. And then they produce more data that we can then leverage these policy engines to say, you can't deploy that in that region at this time on this kernel for this app. And now we have a whole new generation of tools that will follow. So this whole Kubernetes mindset, this whole idea is about getting us to this infrastructure as data component.
So you mentioned something which is interesting. It provides kind of like a framework for the next generation of tools. What is next? What do you see in your mind as the next thing on top of Kubernetes or after Kubernetes? What do you see out there?
So one thing the industry struggled with is decoupling the application from the infrastructure. You hear most of the companies, oh, our apps are stuck on the mainframe. Oh, our apps are stuck on this version of Linux. Oh, we got to patch this thing. When you're stuck on the infrastructure, you can't do much, right? Everything has to cater to the infrastructure layer below you to make any progress. But once we can actually lift the applications away from the OS, our compilers are starting to do it. Like Golang can cross compile from my Mac laptop. I can generate binaries from Linux and for Windows because it does a great job of effectively decoupling me from the low level bits of the operating system. So when you do that for infrastructure, think about when you're shipping a package at FedEx, right? You're saying, hey, here's a box. You don't care if it goes by boat, train, truck, or airplane. We can do anything we want with that particular package. If FedEx invents teleportation, they'll take your package and teleport it to the other side. And they'll be able to do that without asking you because they don't have to cater to the decisions you made before. Oh, my box only fits on trucks. Well, that's not the contract. So it's open season. So next generation infrastructure looks like Cloudflare Workers, where now they're saying we have thousands of data centers on the edge. And since we've decoupled you from the machine, I can run you under WASM, which is this runtime engine that comes from like the web browser world. And I can treat your snippet of logic like a web browser plugin. And then when you upload it, I can deploy it to 1,000 data centers immediately in a fraction of a second. And that's fundamentally different than we think of provision the server, make sure that it's in the right Amazon account, set up the SSH keys. Like, what are we doing? So the next generation tools will build upon not tying up all their resources dealing with the layers below, and they're going to be free to be creative and imaginative in a way that we just don't have today because of existing investments.
Yeah, no, I think that's some great insight as well. So a lot of, respondents, for the questionnaire or even providing questions have mentioned that, there's a big kind of like movement towards Kubernetes for sure, right? And a lot of companies are actually moving to Kubernetes just because their CIO went to a conference, heard about Kubernetes, and basically this is the way that things are going to go, right? I think, first of all, do you think it's overhyped? I don't think you do based off of some of the things that you've been saying about it. And then secondly, what are some of the cautions that you have to like think through before making the leap to Kubernetes?
Everything starts with hype that's any good. When internet came out, oh, internet, these people are wasting time publishing text online. This is such a silly thing. Books forever. Okay. And what a lot of people don't understand is you don't have to replace everything that came before to succeed. Kubernetes doesn't have to be the only thing in the world. But we're at a point now where if you don't have internet access, you're just not in the game, right? Like, oh, I'm not doing internet. It's like, yeah, you're out of business. You don't do internet? So now we're at a stage now where what are you going to do instead of Kubernetes? You're going to cobble together 10,000 tools to luckily get to where Kubernetes is. So the truth is, could you build a better operating system? Is Linux overhyped? Is Git overhyped? Should we not be using Git as version control? Is GitHub just hype? You get to a point where we cross the hype thing into usefulness. So when you start to have a lot of people running something in production and actually leveraging that and actually doing things that they couldn't do before, now we start to cross into maybe it's just a best practice. Now, here's the thing though, where the hype thing is still valid. Some people aren't understanding the contract requirements to leverage Kubernetes. If you take your app that has no health checks, that has to be started in a particular order, does some weird things to the kernel before it can even run, then your app isn't optimized for being detached from the infrastructure, right? It's clawing on, I want that kernel. I need Red Hat 5.7.4 because I'm looking for that specific version before I boot. If you're in that scenario, then you're not willing to pay the price of admission for Kubernetes. So I think a lot of times is maybe some CIOs are not evaluating effectively. Are their apps and are their teams ready to make that transition to see if they can even get some leverage out of it? Because just buying a bunch of migration tools and saying we need to be on Kubernetes by the end of the year, really missing the point in terms of where do you want to be in 5 years? So if Kubernetes is a checkpoint on that trajectory, and I think a lot of people are treating this like they did with their old software. It's a checkpoint and they can forget about it for the next 20 years until the next thing rolls around. Can't treat it that way.
Gotcha. Okay. So, we're up to 216 participants, which I think is great, but, we have kind of a varied audience, varied audience who actually has been doing DevOps for a long time. We've got people, on board who actually are just starting off as well. A couple questions kind of came in as far as, varied experiences with cloud engineering and DevOps. What's the best advice that you would have for somebody who actually has a long history with IT, but is transitioning into like this new cloud role? What kind of recommendations do you have for people to get started? And how do you actually make the jump to this type of role?
You are not your role. You are not a Linux system administrator. You are not a VMware architect. You're not a Juniper certified. You're not any of those things. You just happen to be hopefully a professional that chose a certain career that rewards learning over time. If you're willing to take a sense of ownership, meaning, hey, I see what the mission is. Here's my current skill set, and here's how I can apply it. If you're willing to give me a little bit of time, I'm willing to learn a new skill set and apply it. That's the fundamentals here. You can call it DevOps, you can call it Agile, you can call it whatever you want. In every profession in the world, before we had those buzzwords, the world was able to function in a way where there's a certain set of humans who understand that. Now, if you understand the fundamentals of computing, you understand that, hey, the cloud has some servers that I can rent out with an API, right? That's all it is, right? Like when I call a Lyft, do we call that cloud car service? No, it's like I need a ride and someone's going to come pick you up in a car, probably like the one you have, and you already know what to do. You're going to get in the seat and they're going to drive. And if they make the wrong turn, you'll say, hey, that's not the right turn, because you understand the fundamentals of how to go from point A to point B. And when people start thinking about cloud, they think of it this foreign computing land. It's still x86. You're still using the same compilers. These are the same fundamentals for almost 40 years. It's the same thing. The thing you have to look at, though, is why is the service so good? How did they come up with this idea that without talking to anyone, if I want 1,000 servers, here's the price, here's how you get 1,000 servers, and the thing that I get back is a server ready to log into. That's where we're saying that you have to raise the bar. So if you've been doing IT, I meet people, Kelsey, I have 700 years of IT experience. And I really talked to them, and it turns out they have 700 years of 1 year experience. They have never pushed the boundaries. Everything is, oh, I got trained on this product. It told me to twist the knobs in this direction. If that doesn't work, I call the vendor. Well, if that's all you're doing, then you kind of resigned yourself to a limited skill set that can't really impact any new ideas. And you're not demonstrating the willingness to learn things that you don't know with time to contribute. So if you show up and say, I'm a VMware certified engineer, if VMware doesn't do it, the company can't do it. You're not going to be very helpful. So what we're going to do is going to put you over here to the side. You're going to be the senior lead architect VMware engineer of the century. But when we go to cloud, we're not going to talk to you because you haven't demonstrated that you actually care about the fundamentals and leveraging those things. So I think if you want to be in the skill set, you literally have to look at the mirror and say, what am I willing to bring on the table? If I'm willing to bring certain things to the table, it involves learning. The team says they want to use Vault. Don't go around criticizing Vault. Don't go around saying it's just hype. What you do is you download Vault, you run it, and you say, what problem is Vault trying to solve? Oh, today I'm copying around files by hand. I have no rotation policy for my username and passwords. You, sir, have a problem. You look at Vault and you say, wow, I like to take on this. I don't understand why it looks a little bit overcomplicated, but it does solve this problem. Let's see if I could just make this small transition for myself first. So now that I've made my own personal transition, I can now contribute to the broader aspects of what the team is trying to do. But most people don't take the time to do that. It's all about convince me Vault is good. Why am I convinced? You're the professional. You're supposed to keep track of the various tools that are available to you. So when we go off to build things, I want you to bring the right tool, right? You're a caveman coming with a stick and a hammer tied to it. And it's like, what are you doing? We got hammers now. It's like, yeah, no. I roll with sticks and stones. That's what we do. And it's like, bro.
You want like the Flintstones or what?
I mean, if you're a Flintstone, then it's cool. But you're not a Flintstone. You know what I mean? Like, so you got to make sure that you're staying up to date if you want to be a professional who is paid to actually execute. There we go.
Gotcha. No, that's great. And the next question, I think you've kind of touched a little bit on as far as infrastructure as data, decoupling, applications from infrastructure. But, what are some of the other top cloud technologies and DevOps workflow patterns that you yourself are keeping an eye on? How do you think DevOps essentially will evolve in the next 5 years?
So I'm going to tie this with the question that I saw pop up in chat, which is, you're a highly motivated, knowledgeable, efficient individual. How do you manage your schedule and sustain your momentum? So one thing I've kind of learned is I got to respect the fundamentals. So that means I will go read mailing lists from 15, 20 years ago and kind of see what debates they went through on some of these fundamentals. So let's use service mesh, for example. We can kind of see that a lot of cloud native patterns around health checks, observability to take advantage of all this stuff, even the stuff that HashiCorp is producing. What point of it all if I don't know if my apps are running, I don't have them locked down and they're secure. So now what I got to do as a professional, right? So internally, I'm an executive. I sponsor some, of our biggest corporate accounts. I also sponsor some technology projects. But here's the thing: I can't show up and not know how this stuff is supposed to work. I can't show up and understand how this stuff is supposed to be leveraged and when they're making the wrong trade-off. So what I tend to do with my calendar is, if you look at my calendar, you'll see blocks on there like 2 hours. Kelsey, you got to write some code and try to integrate open policy agents. I got to feel what's good about it. I got to feel when it falls over. I got to see how much traffic it can handle, how much latency it handles. And I'll give myself a year to really get good at this stuff. I'll roll Envoy by hand. So when you see me do something like Kubernetes the hard way and I build it up from the ground up, is because I personally made the investment in myself. And I figure, why not share that with other people? So I always have this kind of learning in public element because it's my force and function to stay on top of my game. So I typically make room to learn, not the things that the company asked me for, but the things I think I need to be successful in the space. So right now I see a lot of traction in this service mesh architecture. We're taking identity serious now. We're saying that we need to understand how our apps talk to each other. No more getting behind the firewall and just making any call you want and hoping that you don't leak customer data. So now that we're being intentional and the tools are showing up, what you're starting to see now is that now the bar has been risen. So if you're a security auditor and you get a taste of what's possible, your recommendations will change and say, hey, even though I certified that 2 years ago, that's no longer the state of art. We need to start looking at zero trust. You need to start looking at some of these tools that can allow you to implement that kind of thing. So I think the industry is now saying we have some good ideas around compute with serverless, containers, and VMs are still a thing, and they're still a good choice for a lot of workloads. Now we got to shift focus to, once you pick one of those compute layers, what is the application layer doing? Do we have the right abstractions at that layer? And that's where I think service mesh is pulling on the right threads. And remember, when I say service mesh, this is not about just containers and Envoy running in sidecars. If you think about Cloud Run internally at Google, and I'm pretty sure the other cloud providers as well, we all have a sidecar that's doing things like traffic routing, security stuff, because we don't want you to have to do it in every app that you build. We want you to get rid of this serverless server mindset. So what we do is we take the concepts from service mesh and we layer it in by default. And you don't even know you're using a service mesh, but you're definitely benefiting from one.
Gotcha. Oh, that's great. I know we're, got 12 minutes left. I've got two last questions for you. And then I see a flood of questions coming in and some great questions. I want to try to get to as many as possible. But, second to last question for you. What is the most unexpected lesson that you've learned in your career?
The most unexpected lesson, I've learned a lot of them, but I think the one that really changed my thinking was it don't matter. Jenkins versus Spinning, don't matter. Pick one, go super deep, and when you get low enough, you can make a decision. Do I contribute to this project, write a little code to make it do the things I want? Or do I abandon ship and try something else? And most of these things will have a shelf life based on the number of people who are willing to do what I just said. If you have a healthy community of people doing that, you'll benefit from that work. You can go and influence people to do that work. So when people are paralyzed in decisions, like for 25 years, people have been talking about CI/CD. Oh, we're going to get a CI/CD pipeline. I'm like, literally, that is not innovation. CI/CD pipelines is not a form of innovation. It's like going to the grocery store, buying a bunch of ingredients off the shelf, putting them together, following a recipe you found online, and say, haha, I innovated this cake. It's like, what are you talking about? That's just, you just went to Walmart and bought some cake mix. Like, I'm surprised it took you this long. Just buy the cake. Or you could have just bought a cake. Like, the cake is nasty. Like, you didn't even mix it correctly. Like, this is your first try. Like, yeah, you're not don't open a bakery. No, you're not a baker. Stop. You don't even have enough flour. Like, how are you going to do that? Like, you're advertising things you don't have. So the thing is, if you start to do the math and all the ingredients cost as much as the final product, stop. Just stop. Like, unless you just want to kind of kick the tires, go ahead. But trust me, when I had to buy cupcakes, like when my daughter was young, I just went and bought like 100 cupcakes that were already finished. I could have definitely flexed my muscle and said, I baked all of these, but it was cheaper to buy the cupcakes. So I think a lot of people just need to kind of, return to reality on that front.
Yeah, it's interesting because my wife is she's super creative, and she kind of is one that likes baking and creating these crazy cakes. So I got the different perspective where she's like, this is what I'm going to build, and this is what I'm going to be focused on, and I'm going to do it no matter how long it takes me. So,
But she's committed to it though,
sure.
right? When you're committed to excellence, before you let somebody taste it, you're going to taste it first.
Yeah.
Right? You can be like, this ain't, I'm not trash. Like, you just threw a whole cake away. What are you doing? It's like, it ain't right, because I have a definition of right. And if that's the way you're attacking problems, then I know you're going to be successful. But if that's not the way you're approaching things, then not going to work out the same.
I hear you. So last question for you, Kelsey, before I actually kind of go through some of the questions. This is going to be a really interesting one for me. But so what do we have to do to get you to wear another HashiCorp t-shirt for a month? I'm putting a challenge out there for you.
I'll send your team an invoice. You're dealing with Kelsey 3.0 now, so the price goes up. You know what I'm saying? You hear that? That's the sound of the price going up. So your team get with my team, and we'll figure it out.
That's great. That's great. Well, let me actually just kind of like go through the chat. I'm not going to get through all these questions, but I'm just going to pick and choose a couple I think really kind of stand out. Let me start with the one from Ryan Russell from Citi. So what are some upcoming challenges across industries that you see that you think there isn't a good OSS project working on yet?
So some of the biggest challenges, I think, around federated identity. So you have a lot of solutions that are around like JOT tokens, right? Like you can go ping identity. There's a lot of these services where you sign up for this service, you put all your users in there, your users authenticate, you get back a JOT token. And if you're fancy, you can exchange it for a less powerful token before you pass around your infrastructure. That's pretty good. And there's some stuff in the open source space that's starting to address that. But when you start talking about federated identity, meaning that they're going to be using Active Directory for some stuff, your internal users are going to be using some identity server, and then maybe you're going to be doing a third party. This whole OAuth landscape is challenging. It's really, really, really challenging for most people. So what you end up with is forcing your users to have multiple accounts, right? You ever go log into something and you're like, oh, you need to have a Google account for this app. So a lot of people right now don't really have something that's super great or easy to integrate across everything. So you might find something that's good for the edge of your network, but then it doesn't really work on the inside of your network, right? So you have some proprietary solutions that are trying to do this, but I see a lot of companies struggle with this. And I'm talking about the full life cycle, right? Some people will get a very powerful credential and pass it to every app. You better hope that one of your apps never leaks that credential or attempts to go back through the front door and impersonate the user. So there's a lot of things that the industry hasn't caught up with in terms of where we are, but federated identity is super, super complex. I see people mentioning tools like DEX, and that's something that, Chorus kind of worked on early days, and Heptio and all these other folks. And that's great for a small set of your infrastructure and apps, but that isn't the full thing when we start talking about identity. Think about it. What kind of identity do you need for a batch job that runs for 5 hours and tokens expire in 10 minutes? Most solutions don't really accommodate for that kind of thing. So we have a lot of work to do in this space when we start to think about the end-to-end enterprise example.
Cool. Here's a good question that we're kind of dealing internally with at HashiCorp as well. This is from Jason Cox at Disney. So he was like, the top 3 things we can do to bring more diversity into tech: belonging, building next talent that looks more like our diverse global human family. Like I said, I think every company is dealing with that right now, but love to kind of hear your perspective there.
Humans struggle with this. When you have a bunch of people that have a lot of money trying to solve world hunger that have not been hungry before, they'll say things like, we should just get everyone an iPad and they can order DoorDash and they won't be hungry anymore. And you're just like, you're so disconnected from the problem that even though I don't think you were being malicious, you're just too far from the problem to really be able to have empathy to do it. So when we talk about diversity and inclusion, I really got it. I was on a flight from some trip, and the person next to me asked me what I did because they saw my Google backpack, and I explained to him what I did. And he told me what they did. And they said they work in diversity and inclusion, but they help CEOs understand how their company is impacting the whole world, because it's not just a US problem. And we're on this flight and we're looking around. He's like, look at this flight. We're in first class. We're being served food and drinks, 30,000 feet in the air. Everything is nice and smooth. I'm even on high-speed internet in the air. It's like this is a miracle if you think about it. But this one industry that's worse than tech is the aerospace industry. They have way less diversity and representation than tech does. He's like, this plane was only built by a subset of human intelligence. So aviation has only been around for a certain amount of time. And this is not the best that we could do in humanity. This is what a subset of the population could do. Imagine if we leveled the playing field where we can get all the creative ideas from every inch of the globe. What will we be flying in 2020? And since we haven't done that as a society, we're shortchanging ourselves. And until every engineer that works on code and tech, until every product manager, until every hiring manager, to every CEO understands that and believes it personally, that it's a benefit and not a charity case, then it's going to be a passive thing. It's going to be like, all right, whatever our current numbers, maybe they should go up. That's not how you approach it. Who wants to be a statistic? Who wants to be 3% of the Black population? No one wants to be a percentage on your diversity report. People want to know that you want them for their talents. And you got to make sure that you understand what the various talents are. So great leaders understand where they're short. Hey, we need someone that's really good at X. So what we're going to do is instead of hiring people who look like everyone else on the team or think like everyone else is on the team, we're going to go out and make sure that we find people with the missing skill set that we don't have. And again, if you're a person that does interviews, you actually might be terrible at interviewing. Just because you're good at writing code doesn't mean you're good at interviewing. So you may be incapable of finding talent or finding someone better than yourself with a different skill set. So I think what we have to do in tech is be very honest with ourselves. Are we actually looking to leverage the talents of the entire globe? And if that is true, you need to understand how it will personally affect your outcomes, and you're not doing charity work.
Yeah, I think that's great. I would agree with you. I think it's an uphill struggle for all companies and for everybody to kind of go through, but I do think that is absolutely the right path moving forward. So thank you for that. We got 2 minutes left. There's a lot more questions. I'm going to consolidate, I guess, one more. There's a couple of questions regarding your personal work-life balance. So let me actually just go through that. So there's 2 questions. I'll read them both because they're kind of, intertwined, but man, I just lost the first one. I'll just go to the second one. How do you balance all that with family and a job? The job does give me some time for learning, but how do you actually provide that balance for yourself?
My wife is an executive director for the school district that we live, and I help her with her work. All the things that I learned in this work, I help her in her work, and vice versa. So when you see me give a keynote, I'm projecting my life on the stage. As I'm learning new things, these are the puzzles that I like putting together. I could do a jigsaw puzzle. Once I see the big picture, you buy that box and you go and solve the puzzle. And some jigsaw puzzles for me are a lot of stuff that we find in the tech industry. But the way I balance all of this is I know the power of having this way of thinking. I know the power of having this network that we have. So it becomes my life. So when I meet someone and they need help in their personal lives. Sometimes it can be through code. It could be financial education, because I work with a lot of financial institutions, and I learned the power of money. All of these things that we do in my life is reflected back in my work. I love to clean the house, keep everything super tight. And when I write code, I keep the same mentality. I'm super patient. I don't need to rush for everything. I just want to put out good quality things. So I try to make my life revolve around that. So what I try to do is make sure that the things I learn in my real life, I can transfer to my work, and the things that I learn in my work, I can transfer to my real life. And if I can do that, then the balance is maintained. I just got to make sure that I log off in time and not staring at a screen the whole time. But that's the way I keep that balance.
That's great. Well, I know we're actually at the top of the hour. I want to thank, first of all, everybody for joining. There were I don't even know, 230 plus, I think at its peak out of 300 who registered. That's a pretty good success rate. If I ask Allie in marketing, I'm sure that's pretty good. But Kelsey, thank you so much for joining. I really enjoyed our conversation. I learned a lot from you as well. Hopefully, like I said, next time we sit down, we'll think about ways in which you can actually get that t-shirt on for the next thing that we actually achieve for you. But for everybody on the phone, thank you for joining once again. The recording will be available, I think, tomorrow, correct, Allie? And it will be posted on our website as well. But once again, Kelsey, a great big thanks to you. Really do appreciate the time and time that you spent with me.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
We also want to thank too Foghorn as our partner of this event. So thank you to them for driving attendance and partnering with us. All right, everyone, have a wonderful rest of your day. Kelsey, thank you so much again. This is a wonderful event. Alvin, thank you. And we'll all see you soon at the next HashiCorp event.
Sounds good. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Hey, bye.